Colonel Derek Voss grabbed Sarah Bennett by the arm and shoved her hard toward the exit door. "You don't belong here. Get out!" She stumbled. One boot squeaked against the polished floor. Coffee cups rattled on nearby consoles. Every engineer in the room froze. She was covered in mud. She smelled like diesel and soil, and she had just told the most decorated tactical commander at Mountain Ridge that his entire engineering team was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Voss got in her face, close enough that she could see the vein pulsing at his temple. "One more word," he whispered, "and I will have you arrested." Behind him, completely unnoticed, the main screen had just begun counting down. 60 seconds. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I promise you, this story goes places nobody sees coming. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Okay, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in those 60 seconds that silenced an entire military base, you need to understand who Sarah Bennett really was and why no one in that room was ready for her. The drive to Mountain Ridge took 4 hours through terrain that didn't appear on most civilian maps. Sarah Bennett made that drive in a truck that had seen better decades, in 1987 Ford F-150 with a cracked passenger side mirror, a heater that worked only when it felt like it, and a faint permanent smell of diesel and soil that no amount of cleaning had ever fully removed. She had driven through the night, arriving just before 0400 hours. And the guard at the outer perimeter checkpoint had looked at her the way people always looked at her in places like this, with that particular mixture of confusion and barely suppressed amusement. "Ma'am?" The guard was young, probably 22. He held her identification like he wasn't sure if it was real. "This says you're a consultant, agricultural and environmental systems consultant," Sarah said. Her voice was even, not defensive, just precise. "And you're here because General Hartwell requested me." The guard looked at her truck. He looked at her boots, genuinely muddy because she had come directly from the East Field, where she'd been working since 3 in the morning, diagnosing a pump failure in her irrigation system. He looked back at her face, which was the face of a woman in her mid-40s who had spent most of her adult life outdoors and who had stopped caring what people thought of how she looked somewhere around her 32nd birthday. "One moment, ma'am." He called it in. There was a pause. Then he waved her through with an expression that suggested he personally found the whole thing deeply suspicious and intended to mention it to someone later. Sarah drove through 3 more checkpoints before she reached the main facility entrance, and at each one the reaction was essentially the same. Confusion, a quiet assessment, then reluctant clearance. She was used to it. She had been used to it her whole life. Sarah Bennett had grown up on a farm in rural Virginia, the same farm her grandfather had built, the same land her mother had worked, the same soil she had learned to read before she learned to read words. She had gone to a state university on a partial scholarship, studied environmental engineering, because it was the closest thing to what she already knew how to do instinctively, and then she had come back to the farm because her father was sick and someone needed to. She had never left. That had been a choice that most people in her professional orbit interpreted as failure, or at best as a kind of noble romantic self-sacrifice that made a good story, but ultimately represented a waste of real talent. Her university advisor had told her directly in his office, surrounded by his degrees and his scale models and his carefully framed professional photographs, that she was making a mistake. "Sarah, you have a gift for systems analysis that I genuinely don't see very often," he had said. He meant it as a compliment, going back to run a farm that's not going to challenge you. She had smiled at him in the way she smiled at people who thought they understood something they didn't. "Dr. Kellerman," she had said, "everything is a system." He hadn't known what to do with that. Most people didn't. The thing about Sarah was that she didn't think in categories the way other people did. She didn't separate living systems from mechanical systems, from digital systems, from social systems. To her, they were all fundamentally the same patterns of input, processing, and output, all of them subject to the same basic vulnerabilities, all of them capable of the same basic kinds of failure. A crop disease moving through a field and a data corruption moving through a network looked different on the surface, but underneath the logic was identical. Both were cascading failures. Both started small. Both got ignored until they became impossible to ignore. She had been farming for 20 years, and in 20 years of farming, she had developed a sensitivity to system behavior that no amount of formal training could have given her because it came not from studying systems in theory, but from living inside them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, season after season, failure after failure, recovery after recovery. She knew what systems sounded like when they were healthy. She knew what they sounded like when they were about to break. General Marcus Hartwell had called her because someone had given him her name, a former colleague from the Army Corps of Engineers who had worked with Sarah on a watershed management project 8 years earlier, and who had told Hartwell when he described the problems they were having, "I know this sounds strange, General, but you need to call this woman." Hartwell had hesitated. He was 61 years old, a graduate of West Point, a man who had spent 40 years inside military systems and who had a fundamental respect for hierarchy and credentials and established process. Calling a farmer was not on its face the kind of decision that felt comfortable. But his engineers had been working on the problem for 9 days. 9 days of diagnostics, 9 days of system reviews, 9 days of briefings and counter-briefings and competing theories. And the anomalies were still there. Small, persistent, growing. He had called her, and now she was here standing in the Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center covered in farm dirt, and Colonel Derek Voss was pointing a finger at her like she was something that had wandered in off the street. "General Hartwell." Voss turned from Sarah to the general, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to make a point without technically losing his composure. "With respect, sir, this facility operates under the highest security classification in the continental United States. We have 17 credentialed engineers with quantum systems experience on staff. We have a direct consultation line to MIT and 3 private defense contractors. I have been running this operations center for 6 years." He paused. "And you brought in a farmer." The word landed the way he intended it to land, like a small, deliberate insult dressed as a simple statement of fact. Hartwell looked at Voss for a long moment. He was a tall man, lean in the way that men who had never stopped working got lean, with silver hair, cut military short, and eyes that had the particular quality of people who had learned to say a great deal without saying anything at all. "I did," Hartwell said. "Sir, Derek." The general's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I need you to stand down." Voss went quiet, but his jaw stayed tight and his eyes tracked back to Sarah with the particular hostility of a man who had already decided what he thought and intended to keep thinking it regardless of what happened next. Sarah paid him almost no attention. She was looking at the room. The Mountain Ridge TOC was a sight that would have stunned most civilians into silence. A vast cathedral ceiling space filled with the kind of technology that existed mostly in the imagination of people who hadn't been cleared to see the real thing. Curved walls of display screens, consoles staffed by personnel who moved with the quiet, precise efficiency of people who had been drilled until efficiency was instinct. Servers lined one entire wall behind tempered glass. At the center of the room, a main display, the size of a movie screen, showed a real-time composite feed satellite positions, radar coverage maps, atmospheric data network status, and a dozen other feeds that Sarah could not immediately identify. It was objectively impressive. But Sarah wasn't looking at the screens. She was listening. There was a hum to the room, layered complex, the kind of sound that wasn't really a single sound, but a composite of dozens of overlapping mechanical and electronic rhythms. Server fans, cooling units, air handling systems. The subtle vibration of hard drives and power supplies, and 1,000 smaller components, each one contributing its frequency to the overall chord of the space. Most people who walked into a room like this heard noise. Sarah heard music, and there was something in the music that wasn't right. She couldn't have said exactly what it was, not yet. Not in the first 90 seconds of standing in the room, but there was something, a quality to the airflow, a rhythm in the vibration that had a slight, almost imperceptible irregularity to it, the way a heartbeat sounds when something is just beginning to go wrong. She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was listening to something most people couldn't hear. "Ms. Bennett," Hartwell was standing beside her. Up close, he was more tired than he looked from across the room. The lines around his eyes were deeper than they should have been for a man his age, and there was a quality to his attention, a controlled urgency that told her this situation had been keeping him awake. "Thank you for coming," he said. He said it with the same matter-of-fact directness he probably used to thank subordinates, which somehow made it more genuine than if he'd said it with warmth. "I'll be direct with you. We have anomalies in our primary systems that we cannot explain. They're small, but they're persistent, and they've been growing over the last 9 days. Our engineers believe they represent calibration drift. I'm not convinced. What kind of anomalies? Sarah asked. Walk with me. He walked her to a console where a young engineer, late 20s, dark circles under his eyes, the slightly wired quality of someone running on coffee, and anxiety was monitoring a feed of what appeared to be satellite telemetry data. Specialist Reeves Hartwell said, "Show her." Reeves pulled up a timeline view. "Okay, so here," he pointed to a series of data points. "You can see the synchronization latency for the primary satellite cluster. It should be under 5 milliseconds across the board. Starting about 9 days ago, we started seeing drift very small, 0.3, 0.7 milliseconds, but it's not consistent. It comes and goes. And it's happening across all 3 satellite arrays simultaneously, which doesn't make sense from a hardware perspective because they're on independent systems." Sarah looked at the timeline. "Show me the environmental sensor data for the same period." Reeves glanced at Hartwell. Hartwell nodded. Reeves pulled up a second window. Sarah leaned forward. "Your atmospheric pressure readings," she said, "they're running about 2% high, consistently." "That's within," Reeves started. "Within normal operating parameters, yes, but look at the pattern." She traced a line on the screen with one finger. "Not touching the screen, just following it. It's not random noise. There's a rhythm to it. Every 40 to 50 minutes, the readings spike. Very small spike. Then come back down. Then spike again." Reeves stared at the screen. I see that, but pressure variation at that scale shouldn't affect." "What changed in this facility 9 days ago?" Sarah asked, turning to Hartwell. Hartwell was already looking at her differently than he had been a minute ago. It was not a dramatic shift. He was not the kind of man who made dramatic shifts, but something had shifted. A quality of attention. "We completed a cooling system upgrade," he said. Sarah nodded the way you nod when someone confirms something you already suspected. "Who signed off on the integration?" she asked. That was when Colonel Voss stepped back into the conversation. He had been standing at the edge of the exchange, arms crossed, maintaining the studied silence of a man who was waiting for someone to make a mistake so he could point it out. "I signed off on the integration," Voss said. His voice carried the kind of precision that was meant to establish authority. It was a full-scale upgrade of the primary cooling infrastructure necessary to support the new quantum processing array. It was planned for 18 months. It was executed by 3 contracted engineering firms with combined defense sector experience of over 60 years. It was reviewed by 2 independent verification teams. He paused. "And it passed every diagnostic at every stage." "I'm sure it did," Sarah said. Voss waited for the but. When it didn't come immediately, the silence itself became charged. "Then what," he said carefully, "is your concern?" Sarah straightened. She looked at Voss with the calm, direct attention of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated by people who thought her world was smaller than theirs. "The cooling system didn't fail," she said. "It worked exactly the way it was designed to work. That's the problem." Voss stared at her. "Excuse me. The upgrade changed the airflow dynamics in this facility," Sarah said. "Not dramatically, not enough to trigger any single alarm. But the pressure patterns changed slightly subtly, just enough to introduce variability into the environmental sensor readings. And your AI environmental management system, which is trying to compensate in real time, is amplifying that variability instead of damping it. Every time it corrects, it overcorrects slightly. And that cycle, that correction-overcorrection loop, is feeding data artifacts into your primary processing systems." The room had gone very quiet. Not silent, the hum of the machinery never stopped, but the human noise, the background murmur of activity and conversation that existed in any operational space, had faded significantly. People were listening. Voss recovered first. "That is," he said slowly, I'm sorry, but I have to say this, the most extraordinary speculation I have heard in this room in 6 years. We have 17 engineers, Ms. Bennett. 17, and not one of them has suggested, because they were looking at the system," Sarah said. "I'm listening to the building." Another beat of silence. "Listening to the—" Voss stopped. He looked at Hartwell with an expression that said, "Sir, are we really doing this?" You can't diagnose a quantum processing array by listening to the building, Voss said. I diagnose irrigation failures by listening to fields, Sarah said. I diagnose pump failures by the way a generator sounds at 4 in the morning. I've been working with complex systems my whole life, Colonel. They just look different from yours. She paused. The principles are identical. That is not, Voss started. Derek, Hartwell's voice, quiet, final. Voss stopped. And in the silence that followed, the main screen changed. It was subtle at first, the way most genuinely serious things are subtle at first. A slight fluctuation in one of the status indicators on the left side of the main display, then a second fluctuation in a different indicator, then in a sequence that happened fast enough to be alarming, but not fast enough to be immediately catastrophic. A cascade, 3 satellite telemetry readings going orange simultaneously, a radar duplicate flag, an environmental sensor error message, and then a sound. A single clean digital tone that cut through the ambient hum of the room. And on the main screen in letters that were impossible to miss, System Integrity Alert Automated Lockdown Protocol Initiated, and below that, a countdown, 0060, 0059, 0058. For exactly 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Specialist Reeves's hands were on his keyboard before the 3 seconds were up, pulling up override menus that cascaded across his screen. 2 other engineers converged on adjacent consoles. Someone was already on a comm line, voice clipped and urgent. Lockdown alert T, OC, primary requesting. Colonel Voss was at the main console, his composure gone, replaced by the controlled intensity of a man in crisis mode. Override authorization Voss Delta 77 Alpha. He was entering the command sequence, even as he spoke it. On the screen, override denied threat protocol active. What? Voss stared at the screen. He entered the sequence again. Faster. Override authorization Delta 77 Alpha acknowledge. Override denied threat protocol active. How is it denying? He turned to Reeves. Why is it denying the override? Reeves's face had gone pale. Sir, the system has classified the anomalous data pattern as a potential intrusion signature. It's entered threat protocol, which means it's flagged all internal override attempts as potential adversarial actions. It's flagging us, Voss said. It thinks we're the threat, sir, 0047. Get Foster, Hartwell said, his voice carrying absolute calm that had no business existing in a room where every screen was now showing some shade of orange or red. Now, Dr. Ellen Foster was the lead systems architect for the Mountain Ridge facility, the person who had been brought in 18 months earlier specifically to oversee the quantum processing integration and who had until approximately 40 seconds ago been in a separate room running what she had believed was a routine diagnostic review. She came through the door at a near run, took in the main screen in one glance, and said a single word that was not appropriate for print. How long, she asked. 43 seconds, Reeves said. 0042. Override is denied, Voss said. The system has flagged its own operators as threats. Foster moved to the main console, her eyes already scanning. Her hands moved across the interface with the speed of someone who had designed the interface and could navigate it in her sleep. Okay, I can see what it's doing. It's interpreted the sensor cascade as an external intrusion pattern. It's entered full self-defense protocol. Can you shut it down? Hartwell asked. I'm trying to. She entered a sequence. Override denied, another sequence. Override denied. Every attempt I make to intervene is being read as another intrusion event. I'm making it worse. 0035. Stop. The voice was quiet, not loud enough to cut through the chaos on its own, but something about the quality of it, the absolute steadiness of it, made people pause. Sarah Bennett had not moved from where she'd been standing. She was still looking at the main screen. Her breathing was even. Her hands were loose at her sides. She looked impossibly like the calmest person in the room. Stop trying to fix it, she said. You're making it worse. Voss turned on her. This is not the time. Every override attempt you're making is registering as a new threat event, Sarah said. The system is escalating because you're escalating. You need to stop. We cannot just stand here. Yes, Sarah said, you can. For 10 seconds you can. She looked at Hartwell. General, 0028. Hartwell held up one hand. And for one surreal, almost unbearable moment in a military operations center facing imminent total system lockdown, everyone stopped. The silence was not total. The machinery still hummed. The countdown still ticked. But the human activity stopped. The typing stopped. The comm calls stopped. The voices stopped. And in that silence, Sarah Bennett said the thing she had been building toward since the moment she walked into the room. "It's not a cyber attack," she said. "It was never a cyber attack. The system is in an error loop, a feedback cycle between the environmental sensors and the AI management protocol. The cooling upgrade changed the pressure dynamics in this building. The sensors picked up the change. The AI tried to compensate. The compensation created new readings. The AI tried to compensate for those. For 9 days, each cycle has been slightly larger than the last." She looked at Foster. Tonight, the cycle crossed the threshold where the system's own threat detection read it as an external attack. And every override attempt has been read as confirmation. 0021. Foster was staring at her. Her expression had gone through several things very quickly: skepticism, resistance, recognition, and then the particular kind of horror that comes from understanding a problem and realizing the solution is going to be terrible. "The environmental sensor network," Foster said, "has to come offline," Sarah said. "Completely. All of it simultaneously. Cut the loop at the source." That's against every protocol we have." "I know. The fallback systems will take approximately 4 minutes to compensate, during which you'll have partial sensor blindness across the facility." "Yes, but you'll have systems. You'll be operational. Versus," she gestured at the countdown, 0016. "If that hits 0, Sarah said, "you go dark for how long?" Foster swallowed. "Complete recovery from full lockdown is minimum 6 hours, possibly 18. "Satellites disconnected," Hartwell said. He was not asking. "Yes, sir." "Life support reset." "Yes, sir." "Communications dead." "Yes, sir." 0011. Hartwell looked at Sarah. "Where?" he asked. "Maintenance corridor east wing," she said. "Junction box J14. I saw it on the facility map they gave me in the security briefing. It's the primary environmental sensor trunk line. Pull it and you cut the whole network simultaneously." "That's a physical disconnect," Voss said. That's the only move," Sarah said. 0008. Hartwell turned. "Captain Morrison." A man near the door, compact, steady, the kind of person whose stillness in a crisis was itself a form of expertise, came to attention. "Sir, take Ms. Bennett to J14. Authorize her to perform whatever physical disconnects she determines are necessary." He paused. "Move." 0006. Voss made a sound that might have been the beginning of a protest. Hartwell looked at him. Voss went quiet. Sarah was already moving toward the door, Captain Morrison falling into step beside her, and she did not run. She walked fast, purposefully, with the economy of motion of a woman who had spent decades moving through spaces where panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. And they went through the door and into the corridor, and the door swung shut behind them, and the TOC returned to its silence and its countdown and the terrible patience of a room full of people who had nothing to do but watch the numbers fall. 00040003 0002. In the maintenance corridor in the East Wing, Sarah Bennett's hand closed around the trunk line connector at junction box J14. She felt the vibration in it, the living hum of a system that was running itself into the ground, feeding its own error, eating its own tail. She had felt this before, not in a military facility, not with quantum processors and satellite arrays. In a field, in the dark, in the pre-dawn hours when a pump failure was cascading through an irrigation network and the whole season's crop was at risk, and there was nothing to do but find the brake and pull it and trust that the system would find its own equilibrium when you stopped fighting it. She pulled. The connector came free with a sound like a single exhaled breath, and the corridor went quiet. Not the countdown, not the building, not the people. Just the particular quality of silence that exists when something that has been struggling stops struggling. In the TOC on the main screen, the countdown reached 0, and nothing happened. No lockdown, no darkness, no cascade of failures. The countdown reached 0, and the system, freed from the feedback loop that had been driving it towards self-destruction, simply stopped. The error indicators on the main screen flickered, then began to clear. One by one, orange indicators returned to green. Status lines resolved. The threat protocol indicator cycled through amber and came to rest on blue standby. Not threat, not alert, normal. Specialist Reeves exhaled so hard that the person standing next to him actually turned to check on him. Foster stood at the main console, her hands flat on the surface, staring at a screen that was against every reasonable expectation, showing her exactly the readout she had been hoping to see. Systems nominal, satellite telemetry nominal, radar nominal, network status nominal. She stayed like that for a moment, a person doing the private internal work of accepting a reality that didn't match what she'd expected to be true. Then she said quietly, she was right. No one responded. There wasn't anything to say to that. In the doorway, Sarah Bennett walked back into the TOC. She still had the trunk line connector in her hand, a cylindrical piece of hardware the size of a large carrot, completely unremarkable in appearance, which had just been the pivot point of one of the most consequential 30-second decisions in the history of this facility. She set it down on the nearest console. She looked at the main screen for a moment, at the green indicators, at the stable readouts, at the satellite positions, slowly, precisely correcting their drift back to the coordinates they were supposed to hold. Then she looked at General Hartwell. He was standing exactly where she'd left him, same position, same stillness, same carefully controlled composure, but his eyes, which had been hard with the effort of remaining calm during the countdown, had changed. They had the quality of a man looking at something he had not anticipated having to look at. The base is stable, Sarah said. It was not a question. Yes, Hartwell said. She nodded. Captain Morrison came and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the residual adrenaline still moving through him, the barely there tremor of a man who had held himself together under pressure, and was now allowing himself the small luxury of coming down from it. Nice work, Morrison said quietly. Not to the room, to her specifically. She glanced at him. There was something genuine in his face, not the professional admiration of a subordinate acknowledging a superior, but the real unguarded response of one person who had been in a tight spot alongside another and come out the other side. She almost said it wasn't complicated, but that wasn't quite right either. It was exactly as complicated as it needed to be. No more, no less. Thank you for moving fast, she said instead. He almost smiled. Across the room, Colonel Voss had not moved. He was still standing at the main console, still watching the screens, and his face had gone through something difficult and private that he hadn't quite finished processing. The expression on it was not one that came easily to men like him, men who had built their authority on being the most informed person in any given room. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. Hartwell walked toward the center of the room. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he started saying it. All stations, he said in the clear, carrying voice of a man who had been giving orders for 4 decades. System status check. Full report. I want a complete readout in 10 minutes. The room came back to life, not the panicked, reactive noise of the previous few minutes, but the purposeful activity of people with work to do. Hartwell came and stood in front of Sarah. He was a man who was not easily impressed. You didn't get to where he'd gotten by being easily impressed. And he didn't perform impressiveness, now didn't make a speech, didn't offer the kind of theatrical acknowledgement that would have felt hollow coming from him. He just said, I owe you an apology. Sarah looked at him steadily. You don't owe me one. You called me when your people couldn't solve it. That's all I needed. I should have called you 9 days ago, he said. She said nothing to that. It was true, so there was nothing useful to add. We'll need a full diagnostic review, Hartwell continued, of the cooling integration and the environmental sensor calibration across the entire facility. I want a recommendation on how to reconfigure the AI management protocol so this cannot happen again. He paused. Will you stay 2-3 days? Sarah thought about her farm, her East Field, the pump she'd been diagnosing at 3 in the morning, which would need to be looked at again, and the irrigation lines that were due for a pressure test, and the slow, patient, unending work of keeping a living system running. She thought about all of it. I'll need to make some calls, she said, and I'll need coffee. Hartwell almost smiled. We can manage both, he said. And in the Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by screens that were green and steady, with satellites finding their positions overhead and radar running clean, and quantum systems processing data at the speeds they were designed to process it, the room settled. Not silently. It was never silent, not really, the machine saw to that. But it settled the way things settle when a crisis passes and you realize how close you came to something very different. Colonel Voss was still at his console. He was very carefully not looking at Sarah. But she noticed just before she turned away to follow someone toward what she hoped was the direction of the coffee that his shoulders had come down from where they'd been held rigid just below his ears. It was a small thing, but Sarah had spent her whole life noticing small things. That was in the end what all of this had been about. The silence that followed the countdown stopping at 0 was not peaceful. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just watched something happen that they did not have a category for. Specialist Reeves was the first one to speak. He was 26 years old, had a master's degree in quantum systems engineering from Carnegie Mellon, and had spent the last 9 days telling himself that the anomalies were calibration drift. He looked at his screen. He looked at the green indicators where orange had been 30 seconds ago. He looked at the satellite telemetry running clean and steady, the radar clear, the environmental sensor network offline, and the backup systems already compensating exactly the way Sarah had said they would. He said very quietly, how did she know that? It was not a question. It didn't have the shape of a question. It was the sound of a mind trying to catch up to something it had already seen. Nobody answered him. General Hartwell had moved to the center of the room calling for system status reports, and the TOC was coming back to life around him. People returning to their stations, fingers moving across keyboards, voices picking up comm lines. But underneath all of that organized activity, something else was moving through the room. Something quieter and more persistent. Doubt, not doubt in Sarah. The opposite. Doubt in everything they had believed before she walked through the door. Colonel Derek Voss felt it. He felt it the way you feel a temperature change before you consciously register that the room has gotten colder in his hands first, then spreading upward through his chest. He was standing at his console watching the status board return to green, one indicator at a time, and he was doing the private, painful arithmetic of a man who had been wrong in public in front of people who reported to him in a situation where being wrong had nearly cost them everything. He did not look at Sarah, but he was aware of exactly where she was in the room. He was aware of it the way you are aware of a wound constantly, involuntarily, without wanting to be. Dr. Ellen Foster came and stood beside him. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at the same screen he was looking at, and they shared the particular silence of two people who had both just had the same difficult realization and were deciding whether to acknowledge it to each other. "The pressure differential," Foster said finally. Her voice was low enough that only Voss could hear it. "I ran the model in my head just now. She was right. The new cooling configuration changed the airflow in sectors 3 through 7, and the pressure variance was small enough to be within normal parameters individually, but across all 3 arrays simultaneously." "Foster." Voss's voice was controlled. Careful, the voice of a man managing himself. "Sir, we'll debrief at 0700. Foster looked at him. She had worked with Voss for 3 years. She knew what that meant. It meant not here, not now, not in front of everyone. It meant I need time to figure out how to stand in this. She nodded and walked away. Voss stayed where he was. 30 feet away, Sarah Bennett was standing with Captain Morrison and Specialist Reeves, and Reeves was asking her something, asking it quietly with the specific quality of someone who wanted to understand rather than challenge, and she was answering him in the same even unhurried tone she had used for everything. And Voss watched the side of her face and thought about the 9 days that had just passed. And the 9 days felt different from this side of 0 than they had from the other side. 9 days ago, when the anomalies first appeared, Voss had been the one to run the initial diagnostic review. He had looked at the data, he had consulted with Foster and the engineering team, and he had made the call calibration drift. Noise in the system, not structurally significant, monitor and adjust. He had been confident. He had had reasons to be confident. 17 credentialed engineers had agreed with him. And now a woman in muddy boots who had driven through the night in a truck, older than most of his junior staff, had come into his facility and in approximately 40 minutes had identified, diagnosed, and resolved a failure that had been building for 9 days and had nearly taken down the most sophisticated tactical operations center in the continental United States. Voss was a man who had built his professional life on the belief that expertise was earned through credentials and experience and rigorous process. He believed in hierarchy because hierarchy was how complex systems stayed functional. You needed people who knew what they knew and stayed in their lane, and you needed gatekeepers who understood the difference between useful input and noise. He had looked at Sarah Bennett and seen noise. That judgment was going to cost him something. He didn't know yet exactly what, but he could feel the shape of it the way you can feel the shape of a loss before you've fully counted what's gone. He straightened his shoulders. He picked up his comm line. He had work to do, and however he felt about it, the work didn't wait. At 0427 hours with the TOC stable and all primary systems running nominal, General Hartwell called a standing briefing. Not a full debrief that would come later with documentation and formal review, but an immediate accounting. He stood at the main console and he looked at the room and he said, "Talk to me. What happened and what do we do next?" It was Foster who spoke first, because Foster was the systems architect and it was her job to translate technical reality into language the room could use. She walked them through it, the cooling upgrade, the pressure dynamics, the sensor feedback loop, the AI management system's error, amplification, and she walked through it with the clean, direct precision of someone who had done the math twice and was confident in the result. She also, to her credit, said this: the pattern was identifiable in the data we already had. We should have caught it. Hartwell looked at her. Why didn't we? Foster took a breath. We were looking at each system individually. The satellite drift, the radar duplicates the pressure readings. We assess them separately. We didn't model the interaction between the cooling upgrade and the sensor network because the cooling system passed all its integration diagnostics and we didn't have a reason to connect it to the anomalies. She paused. Ms. Bennett did because she was looking at the building as a single system. Hartwell let that sit in the room for a moment. He was good at that, at letting things sit without filling the silence with something that would dilute them. Then he said, "Where is she now?" "Coffee room, sir," Morrison said. "Specialist Reeves is with her." "Get her back in here." Sarah came back into the TOC carrying a mug of coffee that she clearly needed and that she held with both hands the way you hold something warm when you've been running on adrenaline and the adrenaline is starting to ebb. She looked slightly less sharp than she had during the crisis, not diminished, just human. The specific humanity of someone who had been up since 3 a.m. and had spent the last hour operating at a level of concentration that takes something out of you when it's over. Hartwell said, "Sit down." She sat. He pulled a chair and sat across from her, which was not something he did with people he intended to keep at a professional distance. The room took note of it. "You said the system was being fooled," Hartwell said, before the countdown started. "That exact phrase." "Yes." "Explain what you meant." Sarah wrapped both hands more firmly around the mug. She thought for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing the version of the explanation that would be most useful to the people in the room. "When you build a system that's complex enough," she said, "it develops a kind of intelligence, not real intelligence, it can't think, but it develops behavior. It starts making decisions based on patterns, and those decisions are only as good as the data the patterns come from." She looked at Hartwell. "Your AI management system was making decisions based on sensor data. The sensor data was wrong not because anything was broken, but because the physical environment the sensors were reading had changed. Small change, but enough, and the system didn't know the data was wrong. It thought the data was accurate. So every decision it made based on that data was a good decision executed correctly, producing the wrong outcome." Hartwell nodded slowly. "The system wasn't failing them," he said. "The system was succeeding," Sarah said, "at the wrong task. That's different from failure, and it's harder to catch because all the individual components are working exactly the way they're supposed to work. The failure is in the relationship between them." The room was quiet, not the strained quiet of before something different, the quiet of people absorbing something. It was Morrison who said what several people were thinking. He said it carefully with the deliberateness of a man who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying. "How do you see that? How do you see the relationship rather than the components?" Sarah looked at him. She seemed to consider him for a moment, not assessing him, but deciding how honest to be. "I grew up watching my father farm," she said. "He taught me that a farm is never just the sum of its parts. The soil affects the water table. The water table affects the root depth affects the yield affects the soil. The following season, everything is in conversation with everything else. If you only watch one conversation at a time, you'll always be behind the problem. She paused. I think that's true of every system. I just grew up somewhere that made it impossible to forget. Reeves from across the room said, so you walked in here and what you felt it? The problem. I heard it, Sarah said. The building has a sound. Every building does. This one had something off in it, a quality to the airflow, a rhythm to the vibration that wasn't quite right. She caught his expression, the expression of a man whose training wanted to push back on this, and she said, I know how that sounds, but you've been listening to this facility for how long? 8 months, Reeves has said, and does it sound different to you today than it did when you started? He opened his mouth, closed it, thought about it. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. I thought I was just getting used to it. You were, Sarah said, you were getting used to the new sound. I came in with fresh ears and the new sound was wrong. Voss from across the room said, that's not a replicable methodology. The room shifted slightly. People adjusted their positions the way people do when they sense a confrontation assembling. Sarah looked at Voss. She didn't look hostile. She didn't look defensive. She looked at him with the patient steadiness of a woman who had been having some version of this conversation her entire professional life and had long since stopped finding it surprising. No, she said, it's not. And you're right to point that out. Voss hadn't expected agreement. The set of his shoulders changed almost imperceptibly. What is replicable, Sarah continued, is the diagnostic framework. The cooling upgrade was logged. The pressure differential data was in your system. The sensor feedback pattern was visible in the historical data if you looked at all 3 arrays simultaneously instead of separately. The AI management system's error amplification pattern is documented behavior for that class of system under these input conditions. She looked at Foster. All of that is replicable. I just knew where to look because I've seen the same pattern before in a different system, in a different context, but the same pattern. Foster said, where? Irrigation network, Sarah said, 2019. A pump upgrade changed the pressure dynamics across the entire network. The monitoring system started overcorrecting. Took out 17 acres of crops before I caught it. She paused. I caught it by listening to the main line at 4 in the morning. Same feeling as tonight. Reeves made a sound that was almost a laugh, not dismissive, but the kind of involuntary sound you make when something clicks into place. Foster was already thinking ahead. Sarah could see it the way Foster's eyes had gone slightly distant, running calculations. The reconfiguration, Foster said. To prevent recurrence, we'd need to recalibrate the pressure baseline across all 3 sensor arrays, update the AI management protocol to flag cross-system correlation anomalies, rather than treating each array independently, and build in a human review step before the threat protocol escalates to lockdown. Yes, Sarah said. That's a significant rewrite of the management protocol. Yes. 2 weeks minimum. Probably 3, Sarah said, if you want it done right. Hartwell said, you'll help. It was not a question, but it also wasn't an order, not quite. There was something in the way he said it that left room for her answer. Sarah looked at him. She thought about her farm. She had thought about it once already tonight, and she was thinking about it again. The east field, the pump, the irrigation lines, the slow, ongoing work of a living system that didn't stop needing attention just because she was somewhere else. She thought about her neighbor, Jim Carver, who had helped her out before when she'd had to be away. She thought about whether Jim could manage the pump diagnostic on his own. She thought he probably could. I'll need to make some arrangements, she said, and I'll need to bring in someone to cover my farm while I'm here. Whatever you need, Hartwell said, and I'll need access to the full system documentation. Not just the current operational specs, the original design documents, the integration logs from the cooling upgrade, and the historical sensor data going back 18 months. You'll have it, Sarah nodded. She took a long drink of coffee. And that was when Colonel Voss walked across the room and stood in front of her. The room went very still. Not dramatically, nobody moved or stopped breathing. But the quality of attention in the space changed the way it changes when something that has been building finally arrives. Voss stood in front of Sarah Bennett, and he looked at her for a moment, and his face had the controlled, deliberate expression of a man doing something that didn't come naturally to him, but that he had decided to do anyway. Ms. Bennett, he said. Colonel. He was quiet for another beat. Then he said, the integration review for the cooling upgrade, I signed off on it. I made the call on the anomalies 9 days ago. He paused. I was wrong. The words came out flat and direct, not warm, but genuine, the specific genuineness of a man who had decided that honesty was worth more than comfort. Sarah looked at him. She didn't soften and she didn't harden. She said, you worked with the information you had. So did you, Voss said. The difference is you found information we didn't think to look for. She said nothing to that. It was true and there wasn't a useful addition to make. Voss said, I had you removed from the operations center. I know, I was there. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. I would like to work with you on the reconfiguration, if you'll allow it. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the room, which was pretending not to watch, registered the length of it. Then she said, I'll need someone who knows this system better than I do. That's you. Voss nodded once. Short. Military. Then we'll start at 0700, he said. And just like that, the axis of the room shifted. It didn't announce itself. There was no ceremony to it. But the people in the Mountain Ridge TOC felt the way the dynamic between the colonel and the farmer had renegotiated itself in 4 minutes of honest conversation and felt what that meant for everything that was going to come next. Reeves turned back to his console. He pulled up the historical sensor data, all 3 arrays simultaneously, the way Sarah had suggested, and he started looking at it differently than he had been looking at it for 9 days. He was looking for the relationships between the data points rather than the data points themselves. He was looking for the conversation. He found the first cross-array correlation anomaly 12 minutes later. Hey, he said to no one in particular. Hey, I've got something. Foster came. Voss came. Sarah came, still holding her coffee. On the screen, Reeves was pointing to a pattern, subtle, easy to miss, but once you saw it, impossible to unsee. The pressure spikes in sensor array 1 are preceding the satellite synchronization delays by approximately 43 seconds, every time. Going back, he scrolled, going back 22 days, 2 weeks before the cooling upgrade finished. Foster leaned in. The testing phase. The new cooling system was running in parallel with the old one during the final testing phase. The interaction started during testing, Reeves said. We just didn't catch it because we weren't watching both systems simultaneously. Sarah nodded. She looked at the pattern on the screen with the expression of someone who had expected to find exactly this and was not surprised, but was still in some private way gratified by it. There it is, she said. Voss was looking at the same screen. His face was doing something complicated. He said, 22 days. We had 22 days to catch this. Yes, Foster said. Nobody made it worse by adding anything to that. Hartwell from behind them said, then we start from 22 days ago and we work forward. I want to know every point where this could have been caught and what we missed. Not to assign blame, Baramatun. He looked at Voss when he said that, then at Foster, then at Reeves. To build a system that catches it next time. It was, Sarah thought, exactly the right thing to say. Not because it was generous, though it was, but because it was accurate. The point was never the blame. The point was the pattern. The point was building the kind of understanding that meant next time you recognized it earlier. That was what farming had taught her. You didn't go back and blame the pump for failing. You went back and built a system that told you when the pump was about to fail before it took the field with it. It was 0451 hours. Outside the facility, dawn was beginning to move across the Virginia ridgeline, still invisible from inside the TOC, where the screens provided their own kind of light, but happening nonetheless. The world was continuing its rotation with complete indifference to what had occurred inside this building in the last 90 minutes, and in 6 or 7 hours, the day shift would come in and the night shift would go home. And the Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center would continue to do the work it existed to do. But something had changed inside it, not in the systems. The systems would take 3 weeks to reconfigure properly, and that work would be painstaking and technical, and would require the combined expertise of everyone in this room and possibly more people besides. What had changed was subtler than the systems. It was in the way Reeves was looking at his data now, all of it simultaneously watching for conversations between arrays rather than performance within them. It was in the way Foster had already opened a new document and was writing the framework for a revised monitoring protocol. It was in the way Voss was standing next to Sarah looking at the same screen and asking her questions with the specific quality of a man who had decided to learn something rather than defend what he already knew. It was in the fact that General Hartwell, 61 years old, 4 decades of military service West Point, and the Army Corps and 3 wars worth of operational experience, had called a farmer in the middle of the night and been right too. Sarah set her empty coffee mug on the nearest console. She rolled her shoulders, which ached in the particular way shoulders ache when you've been holding tension in them for hours without realizing it. She looked at the main screen green across the board stable running clean, and she felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. The feeling of a system that was breathing right again. "I need to call my neighbor," she said. "Make sure someone can look after the East Field." Morrison, who had appeared beside her again with the quiet reliability that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, said, "There's a secure phone in the East Wing. I'll show you." "Thank you." They walked out of the TOC together and the door swung shut behind them and the room continued its work. At his console, Reeves found a second cross-array correlation anomaly, then a third, each one earlier in the timeline, each one smaller and more subtle than the last, stretching back toward the beginning of the cooling system test phase, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to the moment when everything had started going quietly and visibly wrong. He documented each one with the methodical care of someone who understood that the documentation was the point, that the pattern needed to be preserved, not just solved, because the pattern was what would protect them next time. He worked for an hour before he looked up. And when he looked up, he looked at the main screen green stable nominal, and he thought about what Sarah had said, about a farm being a conversation between soil and water and root depth and yield, about every system being in conversation with every other system, about the failure that lives not in the components, but in the relationship between them. He had a master's degree in quantum systems engineering. He had never thought about it that way before. He thought about it now. And then he turned back to his screen and kept working, because the data didn't care about his realizations, and the pattern was still there to be traced, and the work didn't wait for the people who were doing it to finish having the thoughts that the work inspired. That was the thing about systems. They kept running whether you understood them or not. The question was always whether you understood them well enough to keep up. By 0600 hours, the Mountain Ridge TOC had settled into the specific rhythm of a facility running on crisis aftermath, that particular mixture of exhaustion and heightened alertness that comes when the emergency is over, but the work it created has only just begun. Reeves had found 11 cross-array correlation anomalies in the historical data, 11 points in time stretching back 22 days where the pattern had been visible if you knew how to look for it. He had documented all of them. He had printed the documentation and put it in a folder and put the folder on Foster's desk. And then he had sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for approximately 45 seconds before turning back to his screen and starting the next phase of the analysis. Foster had been working on the revised monitoring protocol framework for 2 hours straight. She had 4 pages of notes and a structural outline that was she already knew going to require complete rethinking of how the facility's AI management system categorized cross-system data. It was the kind of work that would normally take months to scope properly. She was trying to have the first draft ready by end of week. Voss had not left the facility. He had not eaten. He had consumed approximately 6 cups of coffee and had spent the last 90 minutes on secure comm lines with 2 of the contracted engineering firms that had handled the cooling upgrade installation, asking questions that were not quite accusations, but that were structured in a way that made the answers feel like confessions. And Sarah Bennett had called her neighbor Jim Carver at 05:08 hours, woken him from sleep, apologized for the hour, explained that she needed him to cover the East Field for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3, and listened to him say in the slow, unhurried voice of a man who had been her neighbor for 19 years and had helped her out before and would help her out again. "Sarah, you just tell me where the pump spec sheet is and I'll handle it." She had told him where the pump spec sheet was. She had hung up, and then she had sat in the chair in the East Wing comm room for a moment alone, and she had done what she almost never let herself do. In professional settings, she had let herself feel how tired she was. Not just the tiredness of the night, deeper than that, the accumulated tiredness of 20 years of being the person in the room who saw things other people didn't see, and having to fight every time to be heard, and winning sometimes, and losing sometimes, and getting up the next morning and going back to the field regardless, because the field didn't care about any of it and the work didn't stop. She was tired in her bones, but the system was running clean, and there was still work to do. She stood up. She straightened her jacket, the one with the torn shoulder seam, where the guard had grabbed her, which she had decided not to think about because thinking about it would make her angry, and anger wasn't useful right now. She walked back to the TOC. At 0700 hours, Hartwell called the structured debrief. He brought in people Sarah hadn't met yet. 2 senior analysts from the intelligence division, a communications officer, and a man named Dr. Raymond Cho, who was introduced as the facility's external quantum systems advisor and who flew in from Washington on what must have been the earliest possible flight, because he arrived looking like a man who had dressed in a moving vehicle. Cho was in his mid-50s, compact with the careful, precise manner of someone who thought in equations and had learned over time to translate those equations into language other people could follow. He looked at Sarah the way academics look at unexpected problems, with suspicion. First, then reluctant curiosity. Hartwell ran the debrief with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the debrief was not just about what had happened, but about building the record that would prevent it from happening again. He went through the timeline, the cooling upgrade completion, the first anomaly, the 9 days of monitoring, the escalation to lockdown, the resolution. He was precise about the resolution. He said Sarah Bennett's name clearly and attributed to her specifically the diagnostic framework and the corrective action. He did not soften it or distribute the credit or frame it as a team effort. He said it plainly the way he said things he meant. Cho, sitting across the table, listened to all of it with an expression that moved through several phases. Professional skepticism, reluctant attention, and then something Sarah recognized as the particular focus of a person who has realized they're hearing something that matters. When Hartwell finished, Cho said, "Can I ask you some questions, Ms. Bennett?" "Yes," Sarah said. "The pressure differential you identified. You said 2% high on the atmospheric readings, consistently with a 40 to 50-minute oscillation pattern. And you read that as a feedback loop rather than genuine atmospheric variation." "The oscillation was too regular," Sarah said. "Natural atmospheric variation doesn't have that kind of rhythm at that scale. It looked mechanical." Cho was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The AI management system's error amplification. How did you know it was amplifying rather than the sensors genuinely reading different data each cycle?" "Because the amplitude of the oscillation was increasing," Sarah said. "Real environmental variation would dampen over time or hold steady. This was growing, every cycle slightly larger than the last. That's not a reading, that's a loop." Cho looked at her. He had the expression of a man revising something. "Where did you learn feedback loop analysis?" he asked. "I didn't learn it anywhere," Sarah said. "I grew up watching what happens when a system overcorrects. Irrigation, drainage, crop rotation. You learn to see overcorrection because if you don't, you lose things." She paused. "I lost 17 acres of soybeans in 2019 to a pump feedback loop. I never missed it again." Cho said very carefully, "Ms. Bennett, the pattern you described, cross-system correlation analysis, feedback, amplitude trending, environmental to digital data pathway contamination, this is the framework we use in advanced quantum systems diagnostics. It's a graduate-level methodology." "Okay," Sarah said, "you applied it intuitively." "I applied what I know to what I was looking at," Sarah said. "I don't know what to call the methodology. I just know what it looks like when a system is lying to itself." There was a beat of silence. Then Cho did something that surprised the room. He picked up his pen and wrote something in his notebook. Not a quick note, several lines. He wrote with the focused deliberateness of a man documenting something he didn't want to forget. Voss, sitting 2 seats down from Cho, watched this. His face was composed, but Sarah, who had become attuned to the smaller signals in his expressions over the past few hours, registered the shift. Something had moved in him, some final resistance. It was Voss who spoke next, and what he said was not what anyone in the room expected. "General," he said, "I'd like to recommend that we formalize Ms. Bennett's role in the reconfiguration as lead diagnostic consultant with full access to all system documentation and direct reporting authority to you." The room went quiet. Hartwell looked at Voss. Voss looked back at him without flinching. That's a significant recommendation, Derek, Hartwell said. Yes, sir, it's the right one. Hartwell turned to Sarah. Ms. Bennett. Sarah looked at Voss. She looked at him long enough to see that the recommendation had cost him something, not in the transactional sense, but in the deeper sense of a man who had publicly staked a position and was publicly revising it and was doing it not because he had to, but because he had decided it was right. She said, I'd want to work with Dr. Foster and Specialist Reeves. Not independently. I'm good at seeing patterns. They know this system better than I ever will. We need both. Voss said, agreed. Foster said from across the table, I'll make it work. Hartwell said, then it's done. And that was that. The debrief continued for another hour, moving through the technical details of the reconfiguration plan, the communication protocols that would need to be updated, the reporting structure for the next 3 weeks. Sarah listened more than she talked. She asked questions when she needed clarification and offered input when she had something specific to add, and she was precise about the difference between those two things. At 0842 hours, the debrief ended, and Cho asked if he could speak with Sarah privately. They went to the small conference room off the main corridor, a functional space with a table and chairs, and a whiteboard that still had equations on it from some previous meeting that nobody had erased. Cho poured himself water from the pitcher on the table. He offered some to Sarah. She took it. He sat down. He looked at his water glass for a moment, then looked up at her. I'm going to ask you something that may seem presumptuous, he said. All right. Have you ever considered consulting formally beyond agricultural systems? Sarah studied him. What do you mean by formally? I mean contracted, with a scope that includes the kind of work you did here last night. He paused. I sit on the review board for 3 defense systems programs. I have been telling those programs for 2 years that their monitoring frameworks have a structural blind spot. They analyze component performance individually, and they don't adequately model cross-system interaction. Nobody on those programs has been able to show me what that blind spot looks like in practice. He looked at her steadily. You just showed me. Sarah was quiet for a moment. I'm a farmer, she said. You're someone who understands how complex systems fail, Cho said. The domain is secondary. The domain is not secondary to the people who run those programs, Sarah said. I just spent 40 minutes in that room being questioned about my credentials by a man who graduated from West Point, and that was after a night of being physically removed from this facility by 2 guards following orders from a colonel who looked at me and saw a problem to be managed. She said it without heat, just precision. The credential issue doesn't go away because I impressed one review board member. Cho nodded. He didn't try to argue with her assessment. No, he said, it doesn't, but it becomes easier to argue against when you have documented work. He leaned forward slightly. What happened here tonight is documented. Hartwell's debrief is going on record. Your name is attached to it. That's a credential, Ms. Bennett. It's not a degree, but in the world I work in, operational success is a more powerful credential than most degrees. Sarah looked at him. She thought about what he was saying, and she thought about her farm, and she thought about 20 years of being the person who saw things others didn't see, and having to fight to be heard, and she thought about whether there was a version of her life where that fight looked different. She said, let me finish the work here first. Cho said, fair enough. He reached into his briefcase and produced a card. He set it on the table between them. When you're ready. Sarah looked at the card. She didn't pick it up yet. I need to ask you something, she said. Of course. The systems you sit on review boards for, the ones with the blind spot. She paused. How many of them are showing small anomalies right now that their engineers are calling calibration drift? Cho went very still. It was the specific stillness of a person who has just heard a question that they recognize as important and who is deciding whether the honest answer is the right answer to give. He said, I don't have direct access to their operational data. That's not what I asked, Sarah said. He looked at her. 2, he said quietly. That I know of. Sarah nodded. She picked up the card. She put it in her jacket pocket. Then we should talk sooner rather than later, she said. Cho exhaled slowly. It was the exhale of a man carrying something he hadn't known how to put down. They went back to the TOC. At 0930 hours, Sarah was at a workstation with Foster and Reeves going through the full historical sensor data, and they had established a working rhythm that had taken approximately 20 minutes to find and was now running smoothly. Foster would identify a data segment, Reeves would pull the cross-array correlation. Sarah would look at the pattern and say what she saw. Then the three of them would discuss whether what Sarah saw matched the technical data, and it did consistently, with a precision that Foster was finding increasingly difficult to treat as coincidence. Here, Sarah said, pointing to a segment from 18 days ago, the oscillation amplitude jumped. Right here. Why? Reeves pulled the facility log for that timestamp. He scrolled. He stopped. HVAC maintenance cycle, he said. Routine, third Tuesday of the month. The maintenance cycle changed the airflow pattern temporarily, Sarah said, and the AI management system recalibrated to compensate. But when the maintenance cycle ended and the airflow returned to the post-upgrade pattern, the system was recalibrating from a wrong baseline. She looked at Foster. That's when the loop accelerated. Foster stared at the data. She said very quietly, "We ran that maintenance cycle on schedule. We had no reason to think it would interact with the post-upgrade environment." It wouldn't have, Sarah said, if the post-upgrade environment had been stable. But it wasn't stable. It was already oscillating. The maintenance cycle hit the oscillation at its peak and pushed the amplitude past a threshold the AI system wasn't designed to handle. She paused. That's when it stopped being a monitoring problem and became a management problem. 13 days before the lockdown, Reeves has said. 13 days, Foster said. The three of them sat with that number for a moment. 13 days ago, the problem had crossed a line. 13 days ago, if someone had been looking at all three arrays simultaneously watching for cross-system correlation, they would have seen the jump in amplitude and known that the error loop had reached a new phase. They would have had 13 days to correct it before it drove the system into lockdown. Nobody had been looking that way. "I'm going to put this in the framework," Foster said. She opened her document and started writing with the focused speed of someone who didn't want to lose the specific wording of what she'd just understood. Voss appeared beside the workstation. He had a cup of coffee for each of them. He set them down without comment, which was its own kind of comment, and he pulled up a chair. "Walk me through the maintenance cycle interaction," he said to Sarah. She did. He listened the way good commanders listen, without interrupting, without performing engagement, just genuinely taking in the information. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The maintenance schedule," he said. "It hasn't changed in 3 years." "It should have changed when the cooling system changed," Sarah said. Voss nodded once. He was not a man who said unnecessary things. "I'll update the protocol. You'll also want to look at any other scheduled maintenance cycles that interact with the environmental sensor network," Sarah said. "While just the HV, AC, if the pressure dynamics change in sectors 3 through 7, any maintenance activity that affects airflow in those sectors is potentially a trigger." Voss looked at her. "How many maintenance cycles are we talking about?" "I don't know. I don't have the maintenance schedule." He stood up. He went to his own workstation, pulled the maintenance schedule, brought it back, and set it on the table between them. He sat back down. "Then let's go through it," he said. They went through it together. Voss knew the facility. He knew which maintenance cycles affected which systems. Sarah knew which of those interactions were potentially problematic in a post-upgrade pressure environment. It took an hour and 12 minutes. They flagged 7 maintenance cycles that needed to be restructured before the environmental sensor network came back online. At some point during that hour and 12 minutes, without either of them quite deciding to, they had stopped being a colonel and an outsider and had become two people working the same problem from their respective areas of knowledge, and the friction between them had converted into something more useful. Morrison noticed it. He was moving through the TOC on a different task, and he passed the workstation twice, and both times he registered the scene. Voss leaning over the schedule, Sarah pointing at a line item, both of them talking with the shorthand efficiency of people who have found a working frequency, and both times he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since 0400 hours. At 11:15 hours, Hartwell came back into the main floor from a series of secure calls he'd been making since the debrief ended, and he stood for a moment looking at the room. At Foster and Reeves building the monitoring protocol, at Voss and Sarah going through the maintenance schedule, at Cho at a corner workstation running his own analysis of the data Reeves had shared with him. Hartwell had been in the military for 40 years. He had seen rooms come together and rooms fall apart, and he knew the difference, and he knew which one this was. He said to no one in particular and to everyone, "Good work." It was the kind of thing that sounds simple and means a great deal. At 1200 hours, lunch was brought in the kind of institutional food that military facilities produce in quantity, and that tastes of utility rather than pleasure, and that everyone ate anyway because the body doesn't stop needing fuel just because the situation is interesting. Sarah ate a sandwich standing up at her workstation because she was in the middle of something and she didn't want to lose the thread. The something she was in the middle of was this: she had been looking at the cross-array correlation data for 3 hours, and she had found 11 anomalies in the pre-lockdown period, and Reeves had confirmed all 11, and now she was looking at something that was not quite a 12th anomaly and not quite nothing. It was a pattern within the pattern. She sat with it, eating her sandwich, not talking. Reeves, who had developed a sensitivity to her silences over the past few hours, watched her from the corner of his eye. He had learned that her silences were not empty. They were the outward indicator of something being processed the way a computer goes quiet when it's running a complex calculation. He waited. She set down the sandwich. "The sensor arrays," she said. "When did this facility last run a full sensor calibration? Not a diagnostic check, a full physical calibration." Reeves pulled the records. He looked at them. He looked at them again. 14 months ago, he said. Sarah looked at him. He looked back at her. "For the cooling upgrade," he said. "For the cooling upgrade," she said. The implication landed in the space between them like something heavy set down on a table. The sensors had been calibrated 14 months ago to the physical environment as it existed 14 months ago. And then the physical environment had been changed significantly, deliberately, as part of a planned facility upgrade, and nobody had recalibrated the sensors to the new environment afterward because the sensors had passed their diagnostic checks, and passing a diagnostic check and being correctly calibrated to your current physical environment are not the same thing. And that distinction had cost them 9 days of growing anomalies and 60 seconds of countdown, and whatever the full accounting of the last 12 hours would eventually show. "Foster," Reeves said, not loudly. Foster was 15 feet away. She came over. Reeves showed her the calibration records. He showed her the cooling upgrade completion date. He showed her the gap. Foster closed her eyes. She kept them closed for approximately 3 seconds. Then she opened them, and her expression had the quality of someone who has accepted a difficult truth and is ready to deal with it. "How did we miss this?" she said. "It was not really a question." "The diagnostic checks passed," Reeves said. "The sensors were working. We just didn't recalibrate them to the new environment." "Because the upgrade passed all its integration checks," Foster said. "We were looking for component failures. We weren't looking for environmental misalignment." She looked at Sarah. "You would have looked for environmental misalignment." "I always check calibration after any physical change to the environment," Sarah said. "It's the first thing before anything else." She paused. "When you change the conditions around a sensor, the sensor is reading a different reality. Even if it's functioning perfectly, it's not reading accurately until you recalibrate." "We need to add that to the protocol," Foster said. "As a mandatory step, any physical modification to any facility system requires full environmental sensor recalibration before the system goes back to operational monitoring status." She went back to her workstation and started writing. Voss, who had heard the exchange, said from his chair, "That needs to be in the standing operating procedure as well, not just the monitoring protocol, the SOP." "Agreed," Hartwell said. He had come to stand at the edge of the group without anyone quite noticing when. "Write it up, Derek. I want it in the draft SOP by end of business." "Yes, sir," Voss said. And then at 12:47 hours, the thing happened that nobody had been expecting. An alert, not a lockdown alert, not an emergency protocol, just a standard notification tone from one of the secondary monitoring stations. A tone that under normal circumstances would have produced no particular reaction because standard notifications happen dozens of times a day in a facility of this complexity. But Reeves heard it and looked at his screen, and what he saw made him sit forward with a speed that was not standard. "Sir," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was effortful. "Sir, I need you to look at this." Hartwell was there in 4 seconds. Voss in 5. Sarah in 6. On the screen, a secondary satellite array. Not the primary cluster they had been working with all morning. A different array. A monitoring array that handled regional communications relay rather than tactical operations. And in its telemetry data visible, if you knew what to look for in the pattern, that Sarah had spent the morning teaching them to recognize the same oscillation, smaller than what they'd seen in the primary array earlier in its development, but unmistakably the same shape, the same 40 to 50-minute rhythm, the same slowly increasing amplitude, the same signature of a feedback loop in its early stages. The secondary array was showing the same problem, not in the same phase, not about to cascade, but building. Reeves said quietly but precisely, "This array uses a different cooling system. It's on the East Wing infrastructure, not the West Wing upgrade." "Then why is it showing the same pattern?" Voss said. Everyone looked at Sarah. She was looking at the screen with the focused stillness she brought to things she was thinking hard about. The stillness lasted long enough that people around her unconsciously held their own breathing quieter. Then she said, "The East Wing shares environmental sensor trunk lines with the West Wing. We disconnected the West Wing sensor network last night. The East Wing sensors are still connected, and they're calibrated to pre-upgrade conditions, same as the West Wing was." She looked at Reeves. "The East Wing sensors are feeding bad baseline data to the East Wing satellite management system." Reeves said, "But the East Wing cooling system wasn't upgraded." "No," Sarah said, "but it shares airflow corridors with the West Wing. The West Wing upgrade changed pressure dynamics in the shared corridors. The East Wing sensors are reading those changed dynamics against a pre-upgrade calibration baseline." She paused. "Different cause, same mechanism." Voss turned to Hartwell. His face was controlled, but there was something in it, not panic, but the very specific alertness of a commander who has just recognized that the problem is larger than it was 1 minute ago. "Sir," he said, "if the East Wing secondary array goes into the same error cycle—" "Communications relay," Hartwell said. "Yes, sir, regional communications for 4 states." The room went quiet again. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of competent people rapidly assessing a situation. Hartwell looked at Sarah. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at 0-60 seconds, with the specific attention of a man who has learned recently, and at some cost, to pay attention to what she says. "How long do we have?" he said. Sarah looked at the oscillation data. She looked at the amplitude trend. She ran the calculation in her head, not precisely but closely enough to be useful. "At current growth rate," she said, "you have approximately 11 days before this array reaches the same threshold the primary array hit last night." She paused. "But the HVAC maintenance cycle for the East Wing runs on Thursdays." "Thursday is in 3 days," Reeves said. "If the maintenance cycle interacts with this oscillation the way last month's cycle interacted with the primary array." Sarah said, "You have 3 days, maybe less." Hartwell looked at Foster. Foster looked at her half-finished monitoring protocol document on her screen and made a visible decision. "I can have the East Wing sensors offline for recalibration within 4 hours," she said. "We won't lose the secondary array. We'll run it on backup monitoring until the calibration is done." "Do it," Hartwell said. "I'll need Reeves." "You have him," Sarah said. "You'll also need to audit every other sensor network in this facility against the post-upgrade environmental baseline, not just East and West Wing. Everyone, I'm. Hartwell looked at her. "How long for a full audit?" "Depends on how many sensor networks you have." Voss said 14 independent networks. Sarah said 5 days for a thorough audit, possibly 4 if you have the personnel. "We have the personnel," Hartwell said. He looked at Voss. "Coordinate with Foster. I want the audit structured and running by 1600 hours today." "Yes, sir," Voss said. He was already moving. And the TOC, which had been in crisis recovery mode all morning, shifted again into the particular focused urgency of people who have just discovered that the crisis they solved was part of a larger problem, and who have the knowledge and the will to address it before it becomes a crisis in its own right. Sarah watched it for a moment. She watched Reeves pulling up the East Wing sensor data. She watched Foster clearing space on her screen to start the recalibration procedure. She watched Voss on his comm line calling the personnel he needed, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of a man who had stopped thinking about anything except the work. Morrison appeared beside her. He did this regularly, materialized at her elbow at moments when she had momentarily stopped moving. She was beginning to think it was intentional, and she was beginning to think she didn't mind. "You doing all right?" he said. It was a simple question. Direct, the way he said most things. "I'm good," she said. Then, because it was true, and because he'd asked, This is the part I like, when everyone's looking in the same direction. Morrison looked at the room. He looked at it with the eyes of a man who had spent a lot of time in rooms like this under a lot of different conditions, and he said, "That doesn't happen as often as it should." "No," Sarah said, "it doesn't." They stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the room, where everyone was for once looking in the same direction. Then Sarah said, "I need to get back to it." "Yeah," Morrison said, and she went back to work. The full sensor audit began at 1600 hours, exactly the way Hartwell had ordered, because things Hartwell ordered tended to begin when he said they would begin. Voss had organized it with the methodical precision of a man who ran complex operations for a living, and who, when he committed to something, committed completely. He had divided the 14 sensor networks across 4 teams, assigned a technical lead to each, and built a reporting structure that would feed results to Foster's central analysis workstation every 2 hours. He had also, without being asked, built in a cross-check protocol. Each team's findings would be reviewed by a second team before being submitted, because he had spent the morning learning what it cost to miss something that should have been caught. Sarah moved between the teams. She didn't run any of them. That was deliberate, she had said to Hartwell when he'd asked how she wanted to structure her role in the audit, that the most useful thing she could do was not lead, but observe, because leading required her to stay in one place, and she needed to stay mobile. Hartwell had agreed immediately, which told her he understood the reasoning without needing it explained. She appreciated that about him. He was a man who processed information quickly and acted on it without ego. The first 2 hours of the audit produced 3 findings of minor concern: sensor networks in the North Corridor and the communications hub showing slight calibration drift. Nothing at the level of the primary array, but enough to flag for recalibration. The teams handled them with the focused competence of people who had been shown what to look for and were now finding it. At 18:03 hours, Team 3 called it in. Team 3 was working the underground infrastructure, networks, power regulation, backup systems, emergency protocols. Their technical lead was a staff sergeant named Deborah Wills, who had been with the facility for 4 years and who had, during the debrief, asked the best technical question of anyone in the room. She called it in calmly, which made what she was calling in feel more serious, not less. "Ms. Bennett," Wills's voice on the comm was steady, "I need you down here." Sarah was already moving before Wills finished the sentence. She had been at Foster's workstation reviewing the East Wing calibration progress, and she handed Foster the tablet she'd been holding, said, "Keep that running," and walked out of the TOC at the pace she used when something was wrong, and she needed to not communicate that to everyone in the room. Morrison fell into step beside her automatically. "What is it?" he said. "Don't know yet," she said. The underground infrastructure level was 2 floors below the TOC and had the specific quality of spaces that were never meant to be occupied for long, functional, direct everything in service of the equipment rather than the people who maintained it. Wills met them at the bottom of the stairs. She was holding a tablet, and her expression had the particular quality of someone who has found something they wish they hadn't. "Here," Wills said without preamble. She turned the tablet so Sarah could see. "Backup power regulation network. Sensor cluster 4. Sarah looked at the data. She looked at it for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was enough. "How long has this pattern been running?" she said. "Best I can determine, 31 days, Wills said. Morrison made a sound that was not quite a word. The oscillation in sensor cluster 4 was not like the oscillation in the primary satellite array. It was not like the oscillation in the East Wing secondary array. It was those 2 patterns, the way a forest fire is like a campfire, recognizably the same phenomenon operating at a completely different magnitude. The amplitude was larger, the frequency was faster, and it was not in its early stages. "What does cluster 4 monitor?" Sarah said. "Backup power regulation for life support systems," Will said. "Emergency lighting, air handling for the lower facility levels. Water filtration, temperature control for the server infrastructure." She paused. "And the emergency communications array." Sarah said, "Show me the trend line." Wills pulled it up. The trend line was not ambiguous. It showed 31 days of slowly increasing amplitude, with 2 notable inflection points, one at day 13, which matched the HVAC maintenance cycle date, and one at day 24, which Sarah did not immediately have an explanation for. "Day 24, she said. "What happened?" Will scrolled through the facility log. Emergency systems test, she said. Standard quarterly protocol. Backup power systems were cycled through their full test sequence. The test cycle interacted with the oscillation the same way the maintenance cycle did in the primary array, Sarah said. Push the amplitude past a threshold. And then it kept growing, Will said. Yes. Morrison said, how close is it to the lockdown threshold? Sarah looked at the trend line. She ran the calculation. She ran it twice because the first result was not one she wanted to accept. At current rate, she said 4 days. Morrison went very still. 4 days, he said. Possibly 3, depending on whether there are any additional trigger events in the schedule. She looked at Wills. Is there anything in the next 4 days that would interact with these systems? Wills was already checking. She checked for approximately 20 seconds. Then she looked up. Monthly facility inspection, she said. Day after tomorrow. It includes a full walkthrough of the underground infrastructure. Multiple teams moving through the corridors simultaneously, which affects the air handling systems, which feeds back to Cluster 4, Sarah said. Yes. 48 hours, maybe less. Sarah turned to Morrison. We need Hartwell. They move fast. At 18:31 hours, Sarah was back in the TOC, standing in front of the main display with Hartwell and Voss and Foster and Cho, and she was walking them through what Wills had found, and the room had the quality it had during the countdown, that specific charged stillness of people confronting an urgent reality. Hartwell listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said options. Sarah said 3. First, we take Cluster 4's sensor network offline immediately, same as we did with the primary array last night. Stops the feedback loop. Buys time for recalibration. Risk is operational blindness in the backup power regulation systems for the recalibration period, approximately 6 hours. Second option, Hartwell said. We postpone the facility inspection and run an emergency recalibration over the next 48 hours. Eliminates the immediate trigger risk from the inspection, but requires the sensor network to stay live during the recalibration process, which means the loop keeps running while we're working on it. Third, we do both. Take the network offline now. Run the recalibration. Cancel the inspection. Eliminate all trigger risks simultaneously. She paused. It's the most disruptive option, but it's the safest. Voss said, taking the backup power regulation sensors offline means we're running on manual monitoring for those systems. Yes, Sarah said, for 6 hours, approximately. Voss looked at Hartwell. Sir, manual monitoring of life support systems for 6 hours is within protocol. We've done it during scheduled maintenance before. When was the last time we did it? Hartwell said. Voss said 11 months ago, 18 months scheduled review. Cho said from his position at the edge of the group, General, I want to flag something. His voice had the careful quality of a man raising a concern he's been sitting on. The pattern in Cluster 4, 31 days of growth, 2 inflection events, current amplitude. This is not the same scale as what we saw in the primary array last night. We know that, Foster said. What I mean is, Cho said, if this loop reaches lockdown threshold in a backup power regulation system, the cascade profile is different from what we experienced last night. Last night, we were looking at tactical communications and satellite connectivity. If backup power regulation enters threat protocol, he paused. He said it plainly because there was no useful way to soften it. We're talking about life support. The word landed in the room the way serious words land when everyone already knows what they mean, but nobody has said them yet. Life support, not communications going dark, not satellites disconnecting, air handling systems entering forced reset in a facility that had people working below ground level, water filtration, temperature control for server infrastructure that if it failed would take down systems that could not come back up quickly. Hartwell said, how bad, Raymond? Cho said, a full lockdown of the backup power regulation system and threat protocol is potentially a 6 to 8 hour recovery, during which we would be running all life support systems on primary power, only with no failover if the primary system encounters any issue. Hartwell looked at Sarah. She said, take it offline now, tonight. Agreed, Hartwell said. He didn't look at anyone else when he said it. The decision was already made. He was simply announcing it. Voss said, I'll coordinate the manual monitoring teams. Do it, Hartwell said. I want the network offline in 30 minutes and manual monitoring in place before it goes down. Voss was on his comm line before Hartwell finished the sentence. In the controlled urgency that followed, teams being organized, positions being assigned, protocols being checked and double-checked, Sarah stood for a moment in the particular stillness she moved into when everything around her was moving fast. She was thinking about the 31 days, about the things she hadn't said in the briefing, because she hadn't wanted to add to the weight of what was already in the room. 31 days was not a coincidence. The primary array anomalies had started 22 days ago. The East Wing secondary array had started its oscillation at a point she hadn't precisely determined yet, but that was estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 days ago. And now cluster 431 days. 3 separate networks, 3 separate oscillation patterns, all building simultaneously, all feeding on the same root cause sensors calibrated to a pre-upgrade environment, misreading a post-upgrade physical reality, but starting at different times, running at different rates, heading toward their respective thresholds on their own schedules. And the question that was moving through the back of her mind quietly and persistently was this: were there more? 14 sensor networks. They had audited the ones they'd gotten to, but the audit was not finished. 4 teams, 2 hours of work, 3 networks flagged, 10 networks still partially reviewed, some of them not reviewed at all. She walked to where Wills was standing, updating her team's findings on a shared tablet. "The audit," Sarah said. "The networks your team hasn't reached yet." Wills looked at her. Wills was a precise, intelligent person who processed implications quickly. The implication here didn't take long. "We've covered 7 of the 14, Wills said. 7 to go." Which 7? Wills named them. 2 of them made Sarah pay closer attention. One was the radar calibration network. The other was the primary communications relay. "Those 2, Sarah said. "I want them prioritized." "We're short a team," Will said. "One of the other teams got pulled for the cluster 4 response." Sarah said, "Then you and I do them." Wills looked at her for exactly 1 second, the second a person takes when they're deciding whether to mention that they outrank the person giving them instructions, and then deciding it doesn't matter. "All right," she said, "let's go." They went. Morrison, who had been tracking Sarah's movements with the consistent attention of a man whose job included keeping track of where people were, said to a junior officer near him, "Tell the general where she is," and followed them. The radar calibration network was on the 3rd floor in a room adjacent to the primary radar operations bay. Wills pulled the sensor data and Sarah looked at it and felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. Minor drift within normal parameters, no oscillation signature. This one was clean. The primary communications relay was not. It was in a different location in the northeast section of the facility, and when Wills pulled the data and Sarah looked at it, she experienced the specific sensation of a person finding the thing they feared they would find. The oscillation was there. It was smaller than Cluster 4. It was larger than the East Wing secondary array had been when they'd found it that morning. It was at day 19 based on the trend data, and its current growth rate was slower than Cluster 4's, which was the only good news. 19 days, Will said. "Yes." "What's the threshold timeline?" Sarah looked at the trend line. She looked at the scheduled events in the facility calendar that Wills pulled up on the adjacent screen. She looked at the specific configuration of this network, which systems it monitored, which AI management protocols governed it, what the physical environment around its sensor clusters looked like. Without any additional trigger events, she said 11 days. And with the monthly inspection day after tomorrow, Sarah said 6. Will said very quietly, "We need to call this in." "Yes," Sarah said. She was already moving. At 1947 hours, Sarah was back in the TOC for the second emergency briefing of the day, and the room had a different quality than it had had for the morning briefing. The morning briefing had been crisis recovery intense, but with the particular texture of people processing something that was already over. This was different. This was crisis in progress, and everyone in the room knew it. Hartwell listened to the communications relay, finding with the same controlled attention he brought to everything. When Sarah finished, he said, "So we have cluster 4, which goes offline in," he looked at the time, 11 minutes. "The East Wing secondary, which is in recalibration, and now the primary communications relay." "Yes," Sarah said. "How many other networks from the audit do we have left?" 5, Will said from beside Sarah. "We haven't reached them yet." Hartwell looked at Cho. Cho said, "General, at this point, I think we have to consider the possibility that the sensor miscalibration issue is facility-wide, not isolated to specific networks. All 14 sensor networks were calibrated before the cooling upgrade. All 14 are now reading a changed physical environment against an outdated baseline. He paused. We may not have 11 anomalies. We may have 14. The room absorbed that. Voss, who had come back in from coordinating the cluster, for response stood very still for a moment. Then he said, Sir, we need to consider whether to bring the facility down to minimal operational status while we complete the audit and recalibration. Hartwell said, define minimal operational status. Skeleton crew, essential monitoring only. Suspend all non-critical operations until we have a clean baseline across all 14 networks. Voss paused. It would take 36 hours, possibly 48. 48 hours of reduced operations at a facility that coordinated defense across multiple states. Hartwell said, the communications cost. Significant, Voss said. We'd need to route essential communications through the backup relay at Langley. It's capacity limited but functional. Hartwell looked at Sarah. Is Voss's assessment correct? Are we looking at a facility-wide problem? Sarah said, I don't know for certain. I haven't seen the remaining 5 networks. But based on the pattern of what we've found so far, she paused because she was a person who did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported, and what she was about to say was at the edge of that line. I think the probability that all 5 remaining networks are clean is low. How low? She said it directly because he deserved a direct answer. I'd be surprised if more than 2 of the 5 come back clean. Hartwell turned to Foster. Foster said, if we're going to recalibrate all 14 networks, we need them offline sequentially, not simultaneously. The recalibration process for each network requires system resources that we can't run in parallel at full scale. Best case sequential scenario, 20 hours total if nothing goes wrong. And if something goes wrong, Hartwell said, 36, Foster said, maybe 40. The room went quiet. And then Reeves from his workstation across the room said, Sir, I have something. His voice had a quality that made people move toward him. On his screen was the primary satellite array, the one they had been working with all morning, the one that had nearly locked them down at 0-60 seconds the previous night, the one that was now running on a clean baseline with the sensor network offline and the backup monitoring in place. Except the backup monitoring system for the primary satellite array, Reeves said. His voice was careful. The one we put in place last night when we took the main sensor network offline. Yes, Foster said. Reeves turned his screen slightly so Foster could see it clearly. The backup monitoring system uses the infrastructure sensor network as a secondary reference point for atmospheric data. Foster looked at the screen. The color did something in her face, a quick, involuntary shift that she controlled immediately. The infrastructure sensor network, she said. Yes, Reeves said. Network 11. It's one of the 5 we haven't audited yet. The silence that followed was the silence of a room full of people following a chain of logic to its conclusion and not liking where it went. If Network 11 was miscalibrated and it was feeding atmospheric reference data to the backup monitoring system they had put in place for the primary satellite array, then the backup monitoring system was reading bad data, which meant their confidence that the primary array was stable was based on a potentially compromised reference, which meant they might not know what the primary array was actually doing. Pull up Network 11, Sarah said. Reeves pulled it up. They all looked at it. The oscillation was there. Day 26. Amplitude currently mid-range. Growth rate steady. It was not at the threshold. It was not about to cascade. But it was there and it was running and it was feeding data into a backup monitoring system they had trusted because they had put it in place as a fix. They had fixed a problem and the fix had a problem. Hartwell said, can we isolate the primary satellite array from Network 11's reference data? Foster said, yes, but then we're running the array on minimal monitoring, just the internal telemetry, no environmental reference. Is that safe? For how long, Foster said. However long it takes to recalibrate Network 11. 6 hours on Network 11, Foster said. Running the primary array on internal telemetry only for 6 hours is within acceptable parameters. It's not comfortable, but it's within parameters. Hartwell said, do it. Voss said, sir, I want to revisit my recommendation about minimal operational status. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, not quite urgency, but its first cousin. We are now looking at Cluster 4 offline East Wing secondary and recalibration, primary communications relay, flag network 11, compromised in an unknown status on 4 additional networks. We have been patching as we find problems. I think we are past the point where patching is the right approach. The room was very quiet. Voss looked at Hartwell. We need to take this facility down to minimal status and do it right, Voss said. All at once. Clean. Sarah's framework. Foster's protocol full recalibration across all 14 networks in a controlled sequence. He paused. If we keep patching and we miss something, we could end up with multiple networks cascading simultaneously. That's not a 60-second countdown. That's a problem we don't have a plan for. It was the longest speech Voss had given all day, and it was the most important one. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the man who had grabbed her arm and told guards to use force and pointed a finger in her face and told her she didn't belong here. She looked at the man who had walked across the room at 700 hours and said I was wrong. She looked at him, standing in front of Hartwell, making the hardest recommendation available. And she thought this is what it looks like when someone decides to do the right thing instead of the comfortable one. She said, Voss is right. Hartwell looked at her. I came here to fix the primary array, she said. What we found today is that the primary array was a symptom. The facility has a systematic calibration problem across every sensor network. Fixing them one at a time under operational pressure with the risk of trigger events in the schedule, we're going to miss something. And the thing we miss is going to be worse than what we've caught. She paused. Take it down, do it right, get clean. Hartwell looked at the main screen. He looked at the green indicators that were green because they were currently being carefully managed, not because the system was genuinely healthy. He looked at the time, 203 hours. He made the decision the way he made all decisions, quickly, completely, without visible hesitation. Derek, he said, draft the minimal operations order. I want it in front of me in 30 minutes. Yes, sir, Voss said. Ellen, start sequencing the recalibration order for all 14 networks. Prioritize the ones with active oscillations. I want the sequence locked before we begin. Yes, sir, Foster said. Raymond? Cho looked up. I need you on a secure call with the Langley backup relay in the next hour. They need to know we're coming. Understood, Cho said. Hartwell turned to Sarah. You'll oversee the calibration verification, he said. When each network comes back online, I want your sign-off before it goes back to operational monitoring status. Sarah said, I'll need Wills with me. She's the best technical reader in your facility. Hartwell looked at Wills, who was standing slightly behind Sarah, with the expression of someone who has had a very unusual day and is processing it in real time. Sergeant Wills, he said. Wills came to attention. You're attached to Ms. Bennett for the duration of the recalibration process, Hartwell said. Whatever she needs. Yes, sir, Wills said. Morrison, standing at the edge of the group, caught Sarah's eye. He made a small gesture, barely a nod, the kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need words because words would be too much. She acknowledged it the same way. At 20:34 hours, Voss put the minimal operations order in front of Hartwell. Hartwell read it, made 2 changes, and signed it. The order went out to all facility personnel at 20:41 hours. The Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center began its controlled shutdown to minimal operational status at 2100 hours. It was not dramatic. It didn't look like crisis from the outside. It looked like a facility conducting a planned maintenance operation, which was exactly the framing in the official communication. Teams moving deliberately. Systems being handed off. Monitoring responsibilities shifting to skeleton crew stations. The big screens still running, but showing less essential feeds, only the facility's vital signs, rather than its full situational awareness. Sarah moved through it all, checking, listening, noting. She had her tablet in one hand and Wills at her side, and they moved through the facility in a systematic pattern that covered ground efficiently and thoroughly. At 22:18 hours, they reached the last of the 5 unaudited networks. It was the building management system, the network that monitored structural elements, door systems, physical security infrastructure. Low drama in terms of operational impact, but foundational in a way that mattered. Wills pulled the data. They both looked at it. Clean, no oscillation, no drift, calibration, baseline intact. It was the first network they had found completely clean since starting the audit that afternoon. Wills said, that's one. Yes, Sarah said. She made a note in her tablet. Then she looked at the summary she'd been building across the day, 14 networks findings for each one, severity ratings, recalibration priority. She looked at it the way you look at a map when you've finally covered all the territory and can see the whole shape of the land. 13 networks with calibration issues of varying severity. One clean, the clean one happened to be the building management system, which was the network with the least interaction with the post-upgrade airflow corridors because its sensor clusters were in areas the cooling upgrade hadn't directly affected, which confirmed completely what she had suspected since the morning. The cooling upgrade had changed the physical environment across most of the facility. Every sensor network reading that changed environment against an old baseline had developed some level of miscalibration. The severity varied based on how directly each network's sensors were exposed to the changed airflow patterns. It was not 14 separate problems. It had never been 14 separate problems. It was one problem with 14 expressions. She thought about the soybeans she'd lost in 2019. She thought about standing in the East Field at dawn, looking at 17 acres of damaged crops, trying to trace the failure back to its source, following the water through the irrigation lines until she found the pump that had started the cascade. Same problem, different field. Let's go back, she said to Wills. We have work to do. They went back. In the Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center, running at minimal status with its skeleton crew and its essential feeds in its 14 sensor networks in various stages of being made right, held through the night. Not easily, not comfortably, but held. The way things hold when someone finally understands what's wrong and commits to fixing it completely. You said, Part 5 lưu ý việc đủ 3.800 đến 4.000 từ, liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. The night stretched long and quiet over Mountain Ridge, and inside the facility, the recalibration work ran without stopping. Sarah had not slept. She was aware of this the way you are aware of a debt, not constantly, but whenever something reminded her, which was often. Her body had moved past the first wall of exhaustion sometime around midnight and had found the second wind that comes when you're deep enough into necessary work that stopping feels worse than continuing. She had been in this place before. She knew how it felt, and she knew what it cost, and she had decided without making a formal decision about it that the cost was acceptable. Wills had matched her hour for hour. By 0200 hours, the two of them had developed the wordless efficiency of people who had been working the same problem long enough to anticipate each other's next move. Wills would pull the data, Sarah would look at it, Sarah would indicate what she needed, Wills would have it ready before the indication was complete. It was the kind of working rhythm that takes years to build in most professional relationships. They had built it in 8 hours, which said something about both of them. Foster had gone to a cot at 0130 and come back at 0330, red-eyed and sharper for it. She brought coffee for Sarah and Wills without being asked and set it down without comment, which was the right way to do it, and the three of them stood at the Network 11 workstation and looked at the recalibration progress together. Network 11, the infrastructure sensor network that had been feeding compromised atmospheric data to the primary satellite array's backup monitoring system, had come back online at 0312 hours clean, properly calibrated to the post-upgrade physical environment, feeding accurate data for the first time in 26 days. When the confirmation came through, Foster made a small sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of a person who had been holding something very carefully for a very long time, finally being able to set it down. Primary satellite array, Sarah said. Foster nodded. She moved to the main array workstation and ran the verification. The primary satellite array reading against a now accurate atmospheric reference showed nominal across every telemetry point. No drift, no synchronization delay. Clean. That's 4, Will said. 4 networks fully recalibrated and verified. 10 to go, the work continued. At 0447 hours, the thing that Sarah had been quietly afraid of happened. Network 7. The secondary radar calibration system came back online after recalibration, and the verification check showed a problem. Not the oscillation problem. Something different. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Reeves, who had also not slept, and whose eyes had the specific quality of a person running on Will, alone caught it first because he was the one running the verification. Foster, he said. His voice was very controlled. Foster came. She looked at the screen. She said the same words she had said at 0-60 seconds the previous night. What is it? Sarah said, already moving toward them. Reeves said, the recalibration process for Network 7 found a hardware fault in sensor cluster 9, not a calibration issue, actual hardware degradation. One of the pressure sensors is reading intermittently. It works, then it doesn't, then it works again. He looked at Sarah. It's been doing this for, he checked the fault log, 61 days. 61 days. Sarah stood very still. The cooling upgrade, she said. Reeves said was 63 days ago. 2 days after the upgrade completed, a hardware fault had appeared in a pressure sensor in the secondary radar calibration network. Not dramatic, intermittent. The kind of fault that looks like noise and gets logged and doesn't get escalated because each individual reading is within parameters and the pattern of intermittency is too subtle to flag against calibration drift. But for 61 days, this sensor had been providing unreliable pressure data to the radar calibration system. Not consistently wrong, intermittently wrong, which was harder to catch and harder to compensate for. Radar accuracy, Sarah said to Foster, over the last 60 days. Foster pulled the data. She ran the comparison. It took 4 minutes during which no one spoke, and when Foster looked up from the screen, her face had gone the color of someone who has confirmed a fear. 0.3% degradation in precision tracking accuracy, she said. Over 60 days, below the alarm threshold, but cumulative. She paused. It's within operational parameters, but it's not what it should be. Voss, who had come in for his shift at 0400 and was at his station across the room, looked up. He had heard enough. He crossed to them in 8 steps and looked at the screen himself and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, the fault sensor needs to be replaced. Yes, Foster said, before Network 7 comes back to operational monitoring status. Yes. Do we have the part? There was a pause that was slightly too long. I'll check inventory, Reeves said. He checked. The answer came back in 3 minutes and the answer was no. The specific pressure sensor that had failed was a component in the quantum-grade sensor array infrastructure, and Mountain Ridge kept 2 spares of most components. But this particular model had seen its spare used 11 months ago, and the replacement order had been submitted but was listed in the procurement system as pending due to supply chain delays from the manufacturer. The part was not in the facility. The part was, according to the procurement records, sitting in a warehouse in Reston, Virginia, waiting for a scheduled delivery that was not due for 11 more days. Voss said, get me the procurement officer now. At 0503 hours, Voss was on a secure call with both the Mountain Ridge procurement officer and a logistics coordinator at the Reston warehouse, and the conversation had the quality of a man who had decided something was going to happen and was communicating that decision to people who would make it happen. I need that part on a vehicle by 0530, Voss said. I need it at this facility by 0900. You will make that happen. There was some discussion on the other end of the call about authorization and scheduling and standard delivery protocols. Voss listened to approximately 30 seconds of it. Then he said very quietly, are you familiar with what this facility does? What we coordinate from here? What goes dark if our radar calibration system is compromised? He paused. That part leaves Reston at 0530. I'll have the authorization paperwork to your supervisor before you hang up this call. The part left Reston at 527. Sarah, who had overheard the call from 15 feet away, looked at Morrison, who was standing beside her. Morrison said, he does that well. Yes, Sarah said, he does. By 0600 hours, 8 of the 14 networks had been recalibrated and verified. 6 to go. The facility was holding at minimal operational status, and the skeleton crew that had been running through the night was beginning to show the particular fraying that comes at hour 18 of sustained concentration, not failure, not mistake, but the slight slowing of response that happens when the human body asserts its requirements against the demands of the situation. Hartwell came in at 0615. He had slept for 3 hours. Sarah could tell by the quality of his alertness, which was sharper than it had been at midnight, but not fully rested. He looked at the progress board Foster had set up, which showed the status of all 14 networks in a visual display that Sarah had suggested and that Foster had built in 20 minutes because Foster could build things quickly when she understood what she was building. He looked at it for a long moment. 8 verified, he said. Yes, sir, Foster said. Network 7 still pending the hardware replacement. Part arrives at 0900. Replacement and recalibration estimated at 90 minutes. Network 7 back to verified status by approximately 10:30. Hartwell nodded. He looked at the remaining 5 networks 4 in progress, 1 not yet started. He did the math. Full verified status by when, he said. 1400 hours, Foster said. Conservatively, if nothing else unexpected comes up. Hartwell looked at Sarah. She said, that estimate is accurate if the remaining networks come back clean. If any of them have hardware issues like Network 7 add time. What's your read, he said. More hardware faults. She considered it genuinely because he deserved a genuine answer rather than a reassuring one. The sensor cluster that failed in Network 7 was in a location with direct exposure to the changed airflow from the cooling upgrade. The remaining 5 networks, based on their physical locations, have less direct exposure. Hardware stress from airflow change is possible, but less likely. She paused. I think the probability is low. But I thought we'd find 2 compromised networks yesterday morning, and we found 13. Hartwell almost smiled. Honest answer. It's the only kind I know how to give. He looked at the progress board again. Then he said, what do you need? It was the question he had been asking her in various forms since 4 in the morning, 2 days ago. She had noticed that he asked it consistently and acted on the answers immediately, and she had come to understand that this was not a professional courtesy, but a genuine operational principle, that he considered the provision of necessary resources to be part of his job in a way that some commanders didn't. She said, more coffee and another 4 hours. Hartwell said to the nearest junior officer, coffee, and to Sarah, you'll have both. The part arrived from Reston at 0851, 9 minutes early, which told Sarah something about the phone call Voss had made. The replacement took 73 minutes faster than estimated because Wills handled the physical installation with a precision that impressed even Foster, who had high standards and expressed them directly. Network 7 came back online at 10:44, verified clean at 10:59. 9 down, 5 to go. At 11:12 hours, Reeves found the second twist. He had been running a cross-verification check on the networks that had already come back online. Sarah's protocol, which required that each verified network be checked against all other verified networks to confirm they were reading consistently with each other. It was a step that added time to the process and that 3 people had suggested skipping to save time, and that Sarah had declined to skip because cross-consistency verification was the specific check that would have caught the facility's original problem if it had been in the protocol from the beginning. She was not going to skip it now, and because she had not skipped it, Reeves found the inconsistency. 2 of the verified networks, Network 3 and Network 8, were reading atmospheric pressure data that was consistent with each other, but inconsistent with the other 7 verified networks by a margin of 1.1%. 1.1% was small. It was below any single alarm threshold, but it was consistent between 3 and 8, and it was inconsistent with everything else. And Sarah had spent 2 days teaching this room that consistent small anomalies were more important than their size suggested. She looked at the numbers for 30 seconds. Then she said, Networks 3 and 8 share a sensor corridor. Reeves pulled the facility schematic. He looked at it. He looked at her. Southeast Maintenance Corridor, he said, Level 2. The cooling upgrade installation teams use the Southeast Maintenance Corridor as their primary access route, Sarah said, for 18 months of installation work. Foster said slowly, the physical traffic through that corridor during installation. Tools, equipment, personnel, the installation hardware itself. Change the pressure dynamics in that specific corridor, Sarah said, differently from the rest of the facility because the installation activity was concentrated there. The sensors in that corridor calibrated to construction phase conditions. The recalibration we just did corrected for the post-upgrade environment, but not for the residual effect of 18 months of heavy construction traffic. She paused because the next thing she was going to say was the kind of thing that needed a moment before it. Networks 3 and 8 are correctly calibrated, she said, to an environment that no longer exists. The construction phase ended. The corridor returned to normal use. but the sensors remember the construction. The room was very quiet. Voss said, "That's a different problem from what we've been fixing." "Yes," Sarah said. "It means the recalibration protocol we've been using is correct for the cooling upgrade impact, but incomplete for the construction impact." "Yes." "Which means—" He stopped. He looked at Foster. Foster said it. "Which means every network with sensors in the Southeast Maintenance Corridor may need a second recalibration against the current environment, not the upgrade environment, the current post-construction, post-upgrade environment." "How many networks have sensors in that corridor?" Hartwell said. He had appeared beside them without anyone noticing which was a quality he seemed to have. Reeves pulled the schematic again. He counted. He said 5. 5 networks, 3 of which had already been verified and were currently back in operational monitoring status. Sarah said, "We need to pull 3 and 8 back offline." "We just verified them," Reeves said, not arguing, just noting. "I know," Sarah said. "Pull them back offline. And we need to check the 3 other networks with Southeast Corridor exposure 2, 6, and 12 before we verify them." Hartwell looked at Foster. "Timeline impact." Foster did the math in her head. "Add 4 hours minimum, possibly 5. 1,800 hours for full verified status," Hartwell said. "Yes, sir, if nothing else comes up." He looked at her. She said, "I know," but nothing else came up. Networks 3 and 8 came back offline and were recalibrated to the actual current environmental conditions rather than the upgrade phase conditions. And when they came back online the second time, they were consistent with all other verified networks within acceptable margins. And Reeves checked and double-checked the consistency because he was that kind of person now, and it held. Networks 2, 6, and 12 were recalibrated using the updated protocol that accounted for Southeast Corridor conditions, and they came back online clean, and the cross-verification checks passed. At 17:43 hours, Network 14, the last one, came back online. Reeves ran the verification. He ran the cross-consistency check against all 13 other networks. He ran it twice. Then he looked up from his screen and said in a voice that was quieter than the moment deserved and was exactly right because of it, "We're clean." The TOC was not a room that celebrated loudly. The people in it were not built for loud celebration. They were built for mission and for work, and celebration existed for them in smaller, quieter forms. But something moved through the room when Reeves said those 2 words. Something that had been held under pressure for 42 hours released just slightly, the way a breath releases when you've been holding it without knowing it. Foster put her hands flat on her workstation and closed her eyes. Wills beside Sarah exhaled through her nose, a single controlled exhale that carried more than a controlled exhale usually carries. Reeves sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Hartwell said, "Full operational status. Bring it up." The facility came back online, not dramatically, one system at a time, returning to full operational monitoring status as each network's restored feed was integrated into the main display. Satellites finding their positions, radar running clean, communications relay nominal, backup power regulation nominal. Every network, every sensor, every data feed reading accurately against a correctly calibrated baseline. The main screen went fully green for the first time in 61 days. That was the number, not 22 days, not 31 days, not 9 days. 61 days was how long some element of this facility's sensor infrastructure had been compromised since the day the faulty pressure sensor first showed an intermittent fault in Network 7, 2 days after the cooling upgrade completed. For 61 days, the Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center had been operating with degrees of inaccuracy across its monitoring systems, and nobody had known, and the consequences had been building, and they had very nearly caught up. Sarah looked at the main screen. She looked at the green indicators and the stable readouts in the satellite positions, holding exactly where they were supposed to hold. She had been awake for 40 hours. She became aware of this now in a way she had not been aware of it for the last several hours because the work was done and the adrenaline had finished its job and her body was beginning to make a request that she was going to have to honor fairly soon. But not yet. Hartwell came and stood beside her. He stood in the specific way of someone who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. He said 61 days. "Yes," she said, "and we were planning to restore full operations 6 days from now, on schedule with the monthly inspection, without any of this." He paused. with 13 compromised networks feeding the AI management system. Yes, she said. What would have happened? Sarah considered whether to soften the answer. She decided against it. The inspection trigger event would have pushed Cluster 4 into lockdown. Cluster 4's lockdown would have registered as a threat event. The threat protocol would have escalated across systems that were already in compromised feedback states. The cascade would have been significantly larger than what you saw 2 nights ago. She paused. I don't know exactly what that would have looked like, but it would have been worse than 60 seconds. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. You found this, he said. All of it, in 40 hours. Wills found a third of it, Sarah said. Reeves found the Network 11 issue. Foster built the protocol that made the recalibration possible. Voss got the part from Reston in time. She looked at him. I saw the pattern. They did the work. Hartwell said, don't do that. She looked at him. Don't diminish what you did by distributing it, he said. They are good at their jobs. You made their jobs possible. That's not the same thing, and you know it. She held his look for a moment. Then she said, all right. Across the room, Voss was on a comm line coordinating the return to full operational status, with the Langley backup relay winding down the emergency routing, returning communications to Mountain Ridge Primary confirming the handoff. He was doing it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, and his voice carried no particular triumph because he was not a man who triumphed out loud. But when he finished the call and looked up and saw the main screen fully green, he stayed still for exactly 3 seconds longer than operational necessity required. And Sarah, watching from across the room, registered those 3 seconds. At 18:12 hours, Hartwell called the facility back to full strength. The day shift personnel who had been standing by returned to their stations. The skeleton crew that had held through the night was formally relieved. The Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center resumed its normal operational posture for the first time in 42 hours. And then something happened that Sarah had not expected. Hartwell called the room to attention. Not the entire facility, just the TOC, the people who had been there for all of it or most of it. He did it with a single word said in the carrying voice he used when he needed a room to hear him. Listen. The room went quiet. 42 hours ago, he said, this facility came within 2 seconds of a system lockdown that would have taken us dark for 6 to 18 hours. 40 hours ago, we discovered that lockdown was not an isolated event, but a symptom of a facility-wide problem that had been building for 61 days. He paused. We fixed it, all of it, in 40 hours with a skeleton crew and a recalibration protocol we built from scratch. We found and corrected 13 compromised networks, 1 hardware fault, and a calibration methodology gap that has existed in this facility's standard operating procedure since it was written. He looked at the room. That doesn't happen because of any one person. It happens because every person in this room did their job at a level that I am proud of. He paused again. There is one person I want to specifically acknowledge. The room's attention, which was already on him, sharpened. Sarah Bennett came to this facility in the middle of the night at my request as an outside consultant. She was not welcomed. He said it directly without softening it because Hartwell was a man who believed that the truth of a thing was more respectful than a cleaned-up version of it. She was dismissed. She was physically removed from this room. And she was right, and we were wrong. And this facility is operational today because she refused to leave and refused to stop saying what she knew to be true. He looked at Sarah. General, she started. I'm not finished, he said, not unkindly. She stopped. Ms. Bennett, he said, does not have a security clearance. She does not have a military rank. She does not have a degree in quantum systems engineering or advanced AI management or satellite telemetry. He paused. She has something rarer. She knows how systems breathe. She knows what they sound like when they're healthy and what they sound like when they're not. And she knows the difference at a level that none of us in this room, with all of our credentials and all of our training, she knows it at a level none of us reached before she walked through that door. He looked at her steadily. That is a form of intelligence that this facility did not know it needed until it needed it desperately. The room was completely silent. Sarah looked at Hartwell. She looked at the man who had called her in the middle of the night because someone had given him her name and he had been desperate enough to listen, and she thought about what it had cost him to make that call and what it had cost him to stand in front of this room and say what he had just said. She said, I just know how systems behave. Hartwell said, yes, you do, and this room is going to spend a long time learning to think the way you think. From across the room, Reeves said quietly and without self-consciousness, already started. A few people laughed. Not a lot, but enough. Voss did not laugh, but he looked at Sarah across the room and he gave her a single nod, short, direct, unambiguous. The nod of a man who had revised a judgment and was living with the revision without drama. She nodded back. Morrison was beside her again. He had a way of appearing at her elbow in the right moments that she had stopped being surprised by. You should sleep, he said. I know, she said. We have quarters. I know, she said again. Give me 5 minutes. He gave her 5 minutes. She used them standing at the edge of the main floor looking at the room in full operation. Looking at Reeves at his workstation running cross-consistency checks, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had understood in the last 40 hours why they mattered. Looking at Foster at her terminal, already writing the updated standard operating procedure, the one that would include mandatory environmental sensor recalibration after any physical facility modification, and cross-system correlation analysis as a standard monitoring framework and human review before any AI threat protocol escalation. Looking at Wills, who had found her way back to her regular station, but who was running her monitoring checks differently than she had run them 72 hours ago, with a wider lens watching for conversations between systems rather than performance within them. The room had changed, not in any way that would show up on an organizational chart or a facility inspection report, but in the way it was looking at things in the questions it was asking of its data and the connections it was drawing between systems that it had previously treated as separate. That was the thing that mattered more than the recalibration. The recalibration fixed what was broken. The change in how the room looked at things was what would prevent it from breaking the same way again. Sarah picked up her jacket from the back of the chair where she'd left it, the jacket with the torn shoulder seam. She put it on. She thought about Jim Carver handling her East Field. She thought about the pump spec sheet she'd told him where to find. She thought about the drive home 4 hours through terrain that didn't appear on most civilian maps in a truck, with a cracked mirror and a heater that worked when it felt like it. She thought about Dr. Cho's card in her pocket. Two systems that might already be showing the early signs of the same problem. Two systems somewhere where the sensors were reading the wrong reality, and the AI management was amplifying the error, and the engineers were calling it calibration drift. She thought about that. Morrison walked her out. At the door of the TOC, she stopped and looked back one more time. It was not a sentimental gesture. She was looking for something specific. She was looking to confirm what she thought she saw, which was a room that was paying attention in a different way than it had been 42 hours ago. She confirmed it. She turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind her. In the TOC on the main display, every indicator held green. Satellite steady, radar clean, all networks nominal. The Mountain Ridge Tactical Operations Center, fully operational, fully calibrated, running, clean for the first time in 61 days. Outside on the Virginia ridgeline, the afternoon light was moving across the hills in the way it moves in late afternoon, long and gold, and indifferent to everything that had happened inside the building below it. The world had continued its rotation. The light had continued its arc. And in a facility buried into the rock of a mountain that didn't appear on civilian maps, a room full of engineers had learned to listen to the building. A farm girl from rural Virginia had come into the most sophisticated military command center in the continental United States with mud on her boots and had saved it not by being the smartest person in the room, not by having the best credentials, not by knowing the most about quantum systems or satellite telemetry or AI management protocols. She had saved it by understanding one thing completely and without exception that the room had forgotten. Every system is in conversation with every other system. Listen, and it will tell you what it needs. Ignore it long enough, and it will tell you anyway, just louder and at a time of its choosing. Sarah Bennett had listened, and the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the sound of something working the way it was always meant to work.